We're live. My name is Roberto Alvarez. I'm the Executive Director of the GFCC. If this is your first time here, the GFCC is the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils. It's a global leadership network, a multi-stakeholder network with a footprint in 35 countries. And we are delighted that you are here today with us. We have a session here today about natural resources, boost the productivity of natural resources. And I will quickly share my screen with you. I hope you can see my screen, and maybe Simone, can you see my screen? Just to confirm.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So again, we have this session about boosting the productivity of natural resources, and I wanted to share with you first where this is coming from. As I said, the GFCC, it's a global organization, and we meet every year in a different part of the world. In November 2024, we met in Belfast for our annual meeting and Global Innovation Summit. We were hosted by Queen's University of Belfast. And in this picture, you will see the moment when our chairman, Chad Holliday, who's here today, was launching our 2024 call to action. Every year, we create a call to action, a statement of competitiveness principles. And in 2024, we launched a document that was called Achieving a Sustainable Future for All. And what was that call to action? And this is the document. Later, you can go to the GFCC website. You can download that and more. But we organized that document in 10 action areas. And one of those areas was natural resources. So we're here today for a kind of deep dive into that. Our 2024 call to action, as well a document that we are launching today, and later we'll share the link with you, is a result of the work of our whole organization, with members and fellows in 35 countries contributing to the content that we are producing in the GFCC. Natural resources is one of the most complex action areas when we think about competitiveness strategies, competitiveness policies. Technology alone will not solve the problem. This has a lot to say about geostrategy, governance, political sciences, social sciences. It's a complex thing. So what we will do today in this conversation is to explore different angles on how to advance competitiveness, unlocking the value of natural resources. And I will leave the invitation, and again, later we'll share the link with you for you to read this paper we are launching today because of 3 reasons. Because this is a complex theme, so we need different perspectives, technology with political sciences. 2, we need perspectives from a wide range of stakeholders across sectors, from industry, from government, from academia. And this is exactly the type of perspective that we in the GFCC brought to the conversation. And actually, a lot of what we do in the GFCC, it's about this cross-sector conversation, but not just across sectors, but across geographies. We have inputs and ideas coming from emerging nations, from advanced economies, from the South, from the North. So this is a second reason, because what we believe this is something that everybody should in some way learn about and check it out. And the third reason is that because in the document that we're launching today, we have examples, we have a few cases, we have information about things that are being done and implemented on the ground. Those may not be extensive and cover the whole spectrum of policies, programs, and initiatives that are needed to unlock the potential of natural resources, but they certainly have messages for everybody. I think we all understand, or we can agree that the demand for natural resources is booming. We have population growing across the world. We have nations developing, and people want to improve their lives. They want more. We need more materials. We need more land. We need more water. So we need more minerals. So there's an issue about the demand side, but also on the supply side of natural resources, there's a big opportunity to create value for countries, to create value for economies across the world, including and especially in many cases in least developed or developing parts of the world. So on the demand side, on the supply side, we have a rationale to talk about competitiveness and natural resources. But what are the boundary conditions for this to happen? And this was at the core of what we did, what we released in 2024, what we're releasing today, but the work of the GFCC. How can we build solutions that in some way are win-win solutions for the environment, for the economy, for societies? How can we do that? How can we take the opportunity to develop the supply, meet demand in a truly sustainable socially, economic, the conversation that we will have today, and what is in the document. We mapped 3 key opportunities. One, it's about technology and developing new technologies. The second one, it's about disseminating those across the world, across geographies. And third, about regenerating natural resources. In the document that we will release, and again, later, we will share that with you, we mapped 7 key strategies. And again, we mapped that working with our community in 35 countries. There are 3 of those that I personally believe are relevant, or one is community engagement. We will not unlock the potential of natural resources if we do not work properly with communities across geographies in the world. Second, for sure, we should and we need to leverage the potential of technology. And third, we need to do that in a way in which we can help others to have access to the tools, to the technologies that they can use to improve their own realities and to develop and to unlock the value of those resources. A fourth thing, because I am Brazilian, I come from Brazil, and I'm seeing lots of opportunities related to that, it's about regeneration. But I'll leave that for the conversation. But the question really is how to do that. And to address this, we have 3 amazing leaders here today with us. Our chairman, Chad Holliday. Chad is a tremendously successful, experienced business leader, global business leader. He led organizations such as DuPont, Bank of America, Royal Dutch Shell, and others. And Chad is the chairman of the GFCC. We have Daniel Litvin. Daniel is the founder and CEO of a company called Resources Resolution, who's working at the crux of the social complexity of unlocking the potential of natural resources, hosting conversations, convening leaders, and addressing that complexity. And we have Professor Ken Sloan, who's the president of Harper Adams University. The paper we are launching was co-created with Harper Adams University, and thank you so much, Ken, for the partnership. Harper Adams is very much focused on agri-food across the whole spectrum of technologies, from robotics to biotechnology, and the translation of those into real-world applications, not just in the UK, but across the planet, including in Africa. So boost the productivity of and regeneration of natural resources is the conversation that we're having today. And I invite all of you to be part of the conversation. How can you do that? Please use the Q&A feature here on Zoom to include your questions. Chad will lead the discussion, and Daniel and Ken will make remarks, and we'll have a conversation, and then we will take questions from the audience. I will curate those questions. So I ask you, please start sharing the questions that you have using our Q&A feature. Chad, over to you.
Roberto, thank you very much. Excellent description of what's going on. Let me start out by saying a couple things about Roberto. He spent Saturday and Sunday 2 days ago in the hospital and he's here with us today. So Roberto, thank you very much. But it shows you how much passion he has around this topic, because he would not miss being here today and have a chance to share with you what we've worked. The second thing about Roberto, he has a PhD in systems engineering. If you think back about what he just described for us, this is a gigantic systems problem, the biggest systems problem in the world. So he brings the expertise working with his team at GFCC, Harper Adams and others, to really put this paper in good perspective. I hope when this is over and it's posted, you'll take a look at it, because it's one of the best jobs I've seen of this process. I'd like to introduce this work today with a story from my past. 2 months after leaving university, I was working for DuPont, a chemical company on a large chemical site. I show up to work one day and I see the announcement, we've had a fish kill. We have a release that killed fish in the river. Being a very young kid just out of school, not very much savvy, I immediately marched down to the manager of the waste treatment plant who I'd met and said, why did you have this release and kill these fish? This is terrible. He was not having a very good day. He probably should have told me to get out of his office, but he didn't. So he got me in, sat down, and said we did not operate outside our limits. We were operating at 75% of our limits, well within the 100 that's allowed. But we were operating more than normal. We normally run about 40. You also know that it's been a very hot summer and there's been low flow in the river. We found the fish kill. We found it on a regular patrol, and we reported ourselves and declared it was our responsibility. My immediate reaction was, why did you do that? You were doing everything right. And he said, the fish died. And I said, I know the fish died. Why did you report yourself? He said, if we were the ones that should have seen this, we knew we were operating at higher than normal levels. We knew it was hot. We knew the flow was low. We are the ones that should have thought about that. We were in the best position to think about that, even though nobody in society expected us to do that. That was our job. And I said, well, you're being too tough. And he said, no, the fish died. I share that story with you because that if everybody in this system that Roberto has described could realize we can't kill the fish while we're doing all the other things we got to do for society. Somehow we got to do both. And it's everybody taking a systems view of that and doing what's right at the right point in time. I think that's what you're going to get out of Ken's comments, Daniel's comments, and then the Q&A that we'll have today is understanding what we can all do now, not sometime in the far future, but what we can be doing now in our roles to look at the total system and don't let the fish die in our process. So I'd like to now turn it over to Ken. I've had a chance to work with Ken through the GFCC in the past. I think they're doing some absolutely outstanding work on the agricultural system and much more. So Ken, thanks so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chad, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak. Just to reinforce what both Roberto and Chad have said, I think there's no question that we know that the world is still looking for growth. But what we're trying to do is shift from an old model where we simply consume, create waste, and allow consequences to happen to our biosphere and not have to think about it, to a new model where if we've already extracted, we find ways to reuse, repurpose, and we scale and use our existing resources and systems. And I think the agricultural food system shows us some powerful examples. And I do want to pay my respect to Professor Michael Lee, Deputy Vice-chancellor of Harper Adams, and Dr. Graham McCauliffe, who have both contributed significantly to this work because it's based on a lot of their expertise. So why does it matter? I don't have to go into that. We know that there are significant stresses which are affecting our biosphere at the moment. But there are a number of actions we can take, a number of drivers for our behavior that we can use. And I'm going to go through those really, really quickly. One is we can maximize our existing investments and our existing systems. In the built environment, we're seeing it already, where instead of replacing a building with a brand new set of materials, we often now just redistribute those materials and use them again. That's become a very mainstream part of what we do. In the food system, the Federal Agricultural Organization Livestock Environmental Assessment and Performance Partnership, which has 36 experts in 23 countries, has been looking at how you can create circularity in the livestock industry and get the food system and the food industry to use the byproducts to then leap back into feed and soil. So again, not allowing things going to waste. The second action is around exactly what I'm saying, the reuse and repurpose of materials. So some examples with plant-based co-products, whether it's straw or husks or fruit pulp, things that we might have just traditionally thrown away, they can be reused for feed and for energy. There are animal-based co-products, whether it's whey or animal hides, eggshells, processed animal proteins. Again, these are being reused for pharma, for materials like leather, and also for food supplements. So being brought right back into a different way of generating growth. And even with animal carcasses, of course, when they're being used, they're often being prioritized for food. But then there are materials that can be used for feed and then other industrial uses. So waste over time becomes value. It's not just disposed and it's not just pushed away. The other action is around nutrient recovery and recycling. So if we think about manure, we know that manure is used for fertilizer, but there are some really rich things within manure, whether it's phosphorus or nitrogen, which can then be drawn out and used for biogas and give us a more natural way of generating energy, something which is available to people in lots of different countries, not just in developed countries. In slurry, if we separate the different elements of it, we can take the phosphorus out and we can then start to use it to help with grassland agronomy. So taking one natural resource and moving it across. The other action we can do is to scale what already works. We're already seeing biogas being used in different parts of the world. Well, we need to scale it so it has a positive effect on the grid. So not just pilots in different places, but actually generally moving stuff that is already coming from the natural system and using it to create different forms of energy. And also, as I said before, that we're already using great circularity within the animal protein markets. One of the things that is a potential barrier which we need to address is our understanding of the metrics. If we use a single metric for a nutrient with food, often we talk about carbon per kilogram produced or carbon per kilogram consumed. It's not telling the whole story. We now need to look at how these nutrients are being used to drive value, not to just deliver waste and deliver negative impacts. And that requires a different conversation, a different joined up conversation within countries and across countries. So if we're genuinely going to make this shift from an old model of extraction, consumption and waste and damage to reuse, repurpose and scaling our existing investments in a much better way, it's going to need deep and meaningful collaboration between government, academia, civil society, and the private sector. We need to come together and agree an understanding over what it is we're going to measure and how we're going to measure it, so that we can start to reverse the trend that more and more and more is the only way forward. What we need to do is make more with what we've already got, deploy more with what we've already got, reuse more with what we've already got. So the takeaways for me are we need to move away from a model which says that growth is just simply based on more extraction. We need to focus on reuse and repurposing, and in doing so, we can lower costs and we can lower the footprint and impact of what we do. We need to genuinely embrace circularity in our economy, whether it's animal or plant co-products or any of the other things that we've developed and built, and take a serious effort to make sure that we are looking at nutrient recovery and energy reuse. We need to stop thinking that it needs to be new. The technology needs to be new. The precision agriculture that helps us get more out of our soils, more out of our things that we deploy on our land, take better use of natural resources, all quite critically important. But we need to use it and we need to innovate responsibly. And then the final point, which is where I ended before, which is just simply to say, if we want growth and we want to be competitive, there are certain areas where we need to be collaborative, and this is one of those areas. We really need to share our insights and our understanding to ensure that all economies in different parts of the world have got a fair go at using their natural resources. And bluntly, we've got to educate the next generation to have a better, more responsible attitude to the way in which resources are used. Otherwise, we're just passing on a shorter life cycle for humanity in the future, and that's not something any of us want to carry. Thank you, Chad.
Ken, that was excellent. Let me remind everybody before I have a comment for Ken is your questions are welcome right now. Anything that Ken said that you'd like to ask a question about, go ahead and enter. You don't have to wait to the Q&A session as we go forward. Ken, that was highly comprehensive. One thing that struck me, unless I missed it, you didn't say climate change or global warming. Yet everything you talked about was dealing with climate change and global warming. So I think many people don't think about agriculture, the big impact it has on that other question. The question I have for you, though, because I've had a chance to meet some of your students, they're so outstanding. If everybody on this call today could spend a couple hours with your students, how would that impact them? What would they learn from the passion of your students?
Well, as a university, we've got a strapline, which is together we will make the difference. And I think as a university that we've got brilliant academics who are researching and educating in these really important areas of food production, technology, animal health and well-being, sustainability. But we have a will-do attitude at the university. We don't have a can-do attitude. And that's what you see in our students. They are incredibly solution-focused. They take the knowledge, they take the insight, but they actually want to see it happen in practice. They want to get their hands dirty. They want to develop new technology. And Chad, it's no accident. And, you know, this is not an overclaim. This was the first university in the world that ran an end-to-end season with a fully robotic farm. And the reason it did it was it didn't wait for a new set of innovations to be developed. What it did was work with collaborators, and it took existing major machinery like tractors and combine harvesters, took the autonomous systems from another type of vehicle, put the two together and applied it in practice. And from that has been able to learn. So it's a hugely practical, hugely conscientious group of people. But I think, and you mentioned it before, too often when we talk about climate change, we see agriculture as the problem. And actually within the system of agriculture are a significant number of the solutions. We can't just simply switch off food sources and leave people to starvation. We've got to use these systems and use them for the benefit of society as a whole. But they're very practical, very go-getting, and they've dug me out of many a hole I've fallen into.
Okay, wonderful. Great. Looking forward to more Q&A in a few minutes. Daniel, you come from a different perspective. You've had a career actually making things happen, working over 25 critical projects by my count, where we were able to develop natural resources and do them in the right way and make a difference for the country. Now you have a firm that's focusing on that specifically, your resource resolutions. What can you share with us today?
Thanks very much, Chad. Yes, I suppose what I'll share perhaps is a little bit about my attempted contribution, not to kill the fish, to use your expression. And let me first of all say it's great to be here. I read the report from the GFCC. I think it's really excellent. I mean, it covers, as you're all suggesting, a huge set of topics, but in a very succinct way, and cuts to the chase on what is needed. But Chad, as you said, look, my particular focus is, and Roberto alluded to this, my particular focus is when you have major natural resource projects, whether those are mining projects, big energy projects, looking at the social divisions that can arise around those projects, and finding ways, or looking for ways, to bring sides together so as to achieve better outcomes, more sustainable, more win-win outcomes. That's been the focus. And this may go without saying, but you know, for this problem has been around not just for decades, for centuries, arguably for millennia, that where you have mining projects in particular, but other big projects that people will often disagree. And these days, you know, there is rarely, say, a major mining, or indeed these days rarely a major renewable energy project that doesn't provoke some local opposition from people who don't want the impacts near them. Likewise, many of these projects will provoke critiques from civil society groups. There are often disagreements between developers and their host governments as to the amount of tax that is paid, the how the benefits are distributed, and the disagreements encompass everything from the environmental impacts to the sharing the benefits. How is the cake split? And in my work, and over the last 20 years, Chad, as you've suggested, I've focused on a whole host of different projects where these problems have been acute, from mining projects in Peru to mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, to energy projects in North America, mining projects in Canada. So this is not a problem, obviously, exclusively focused in the developing world. And it's not, and this very much chimes with Roberto, the findings of the GFCC report, is that these sort of divisions and disputes, to my mind, are going to get worse, certainly for a while, before they get better. Why? Because of the growing demand for many of these resources, in particular critical minerals, because of geopolitical divisions that are intensifying this, I guess, what you might call the scramble for access between different world powers, America, China, and others. You've also got the issue of polarization, social polarization, partly because of social media. People find it very difficult to agree on anything these days, and this is really playing itself out around major resource projects. And in my experience, it's not as though the companies developing these projects, I mean, some of them will be irresponsible and not care, but a lot of them are responsible operators seeking to do the right thing. So in that respect, they'll do their best to consult with local communities. They'll put in place all sorts of environmental management programs. They'll seek to create jobs and positive economic spillover effects. But nonetheless, in spite of this, what appear to be a good set of, positive practices on the part of companies and investors, or at least some of them, you nonetheless, like I say, still rarely have a big resource project without a lot of social division. Why my question throughout my work over the last few decades has been, so why? What is the problem here? And what I've concluded is it's a cluster of things which are less to do with, or often less to do with, irreconcilable differences between people. There may be some fundamental ideological differences or differences of value systems, but it's also to do with things that in theory can be fixed. One is just a sheer lack of trust between the developers of projects and many of their stakeholders. Another is the absence of a common fact base. Often the facts as to the impacts are deeply contested. And another is short-term mindsets, which to my mind are often exhibited both sometimes by the developers of projects, who may be sort of chasing just enough consent to get the project permitted, but also sometimes short-term mindsets from the perspective of stakeholders who will be maybe focused on the negatives, or focused on achieving certain political goals. All of which is to say that to my mind, and based on my work, through creating the right context for dialogue, where a space for dialogue where parties can build that trust, can embark, for example, on joint fact-finding missions, can get together and sketch out jointly what a project might do over the next 20 or 30 years rather than over the next 6 months to a particular region. There are possibilities for more alignment and for more win-win outcomes. And perhaps I'll leave it there, but that's the founding idea behind resource resolutions, is there are these opportunities for win-wins and for more alignment that can lead to more sustainable outcomes, that in spite of this world of conflict and distrust, with the right sort of interventions, we can sometimes achieve something a bit better. But it ties very much to the theme of this report.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think it was very helpful. A reminder to everybody again to put your questions in as we come forward. Daniel, let me give you an unusual question. you just recently wrote an article about two presidents of two countries that were trying to make a deal over natural resources. Although I think they technically made a deal, if I look at the things you described, like having a high degree of trust between everybody, having a common fact base, a lot of elements were left out of that description, at least from what we could see in the public. From you might just comment briefly if you feel comfortable on that particular paper, but what's the learning from that paper that you're really trying to tell everybody in this, not just those two negotiators?
Sure, and just to perhaps be too explicit, we're talking about President Trump and President Zelensky here, who obviously have all sorts of negotiations going on. But no, look, indeed, that this was there. As many will remember, there was this the Ukraine-US minerals deal, which is a sort of potential model for other critical minerals deals, where major consuming countries such as the US or China or others do deals with resort, naturally, or countries seemingly rich in critical minerals and other natural resources. And to my mind, among the lessons there is to really understand the facts on the ground, because that deal, many have said, it seems to be somewhat removed from the reality on the ground, where the actual amount of critical minerals or commercially viable critical minerals is far, far less than some of the headlines might suggest. But there's also this sort of broader picture of how geopolitics and the so-called great powers these days are seeking to tie up minerals in different parts of the world, and seem, to my mind, to be doing it in a sometimes clumsy, hard-nosed way. Whereas I think the lesson from decades of how countries should wield power when it comes to getting access to resources is that soft power often works better than hard power. In other words, building long-term partnerships, delivering local benefits and national benefits, building support from local civil society. That's the way, to my mind, to really secure resources, rather than a president striking a deal with a president.
Yeah, very helpful. By the way, has either president called you and asked for advice yet after you wrote your paper?
I don't know why not, but not yet.
Okay. Tomorrow it's coming. Thank you, Daniel. So we're going to go into our Q&A session. Roberto is monitoring all the questions that have come in. Let me go back to Ken with the first question, and then I'll have one for Daniel. Then we'll go to the questions for everybody participating here today, which is where the richness will come in this discussion. Ken, I've had a little experience in the agricultural system, and I know it's pretty complicated in itself. What is it, from all the work you've done and your students have done, about the agricultural system that everybody that cares about this focus on natural resources should keep in their mind and really be thinking about as they go forward? A few simple things possible?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is that we all have the power to make a difference ourselves. We're all consumers of resources, and we're consumers of food. So we can actually think about that. We can think actively and mindfully about where we're getting our food from, how we're sourcing that food, because that has an effect right throughout the whole system. The second aspect of it is, though, that I think too often the agricultural system is positioned as if it's a rural problem. It's over there, it's someone else's system. Greater society will not function if the agricultural system is not functioning. We've seen it. We've seen what's happened with the war in Ukraine, the disruption of natural resources, and grain coming out, and the effect that that's had. And many countries have not been affected, but there are plenty of parts of the continent of Africa that have. So I think, one, we should be better educated on where our food comes from and what the impact of it is. And then the other thing in the food system, I would say, is let's just not jump to overly simplistic solutions without thinking of the consequences. So I hear over and over again that the solution to the planet's plight is to basically just scrap meat, and then everything else will follow from that. Firstly, I don't think there's a protein source that's been discovered which is going to feed everybody to the right level of nutrition to enable that to be the case. Secondly, actually, it's demonizing one part of the food system rather than having to look at it all together. And then the third element of it is the world's full of really clever people. Let's not come out with slogans and straplines. Let's engage with the science and technology we've got access to and make the changes that we need to make to actually operate in a much more robust and much more sustainable way than we do at the moment.
Ken, great. That was very helpful. If somehow we could get that message out to everybody, that would be so important. I like the succinct way you did it. Daniel, let me come back to the thing you talked about on facts. I remember the old saying, everybody's entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. So as you found in these situations, how do you sort out opinion from fact where people can get aligned? But what have you learned from your experience with that?
So I think in a typical situation where you have a project and executives leading that project having very often diametrically opposed views to some of the community, many may be supportive, but some who would be deeply opposed, is that as a process, first of all, what you might describe as deep listening to both sides. And it is often the case that positions will be different from the underlying interests, and people will take positions in order to, because they see it that's the way to get their interests achieved, but getting beneath their positions. And then, you know, having an approach where dialogue between the two sides is the framing of it. And I mentioned this before, the time horizon. I think it's often very helpful to say, let's forget about your immediate grudges and needs. Let's talk together about, in 20 years' time for this project, and let's assume it's a project that is already up and running, what do we both sides want the impacts to be in terms of the development of the communities, development of jobs, protection of nature, etc. And with different framing, often some of those what appear to be win-lose issues can become win-wins. So again, there's all sorts of different tactics for this, but I would say that's one of them. Great.
Thank you, Daniel. Roberto, can we turn it over to you for the questions that have been coming in from the folks on the call today?
Yeah, Chad, we have a few questions, some of them related to Africa, also questions related to measurement, right, and metrics. So Michael has posed a question about sustainability measurement and how to measure that, in the sense that most corporate reporting systems assume a linear perspective in agri-food systems. And for instance, Ken has mentioned and has made the case for circularity, right? So how can you convert, let's say, measurement systems to contemplate that, to consider circularity? That was one of the questions that we got.
So who do you think could answer that the best?
I'll have a go at it first, and then see what Daniel would say as well. I think in the end, if you have a look at the sustainability metrics, we have to ask ourselves why we have them at all. What are they for? And if what we're saying is we should not just go for expansive use of new resources, we should be making best use of what we've got. What we have to do, and this is what Daniel's been talking about, is look at the impact of decisions on the community, as well as looking at the impact of decisions on the economy. So I think one way to think about this is to stop reporting just being around consumption, but actually encouraging corporate organizations to see the benefit of how circularity will better represent them in the eyes of their own stakeholders. So if you're doing your corporate reporting and you talk about the impact that you have had on the environment, and then you put off a whole series of offsets against other things, you're not really connecting it back to a community, a positive impact on a community, where you're able to say that as well as being the consumer, we're also bringing things back which have a direct positive effect on a community over here or a place over here in that particular way. So I think it is about balancing it between the consumption and then almost the trying to explain away the consumption aspect and actually saying that as well as being consumers, we are also able to make a positive redistributive impact on different communities by thinking about what we do. But as you know, Chad, in the corporate world, if we don't measure it and we don't report it, then it's not valued. So unless we start to see circularity properly embedded within corporate reporting, then there is a risk it is just a side issue for a set of people in particular industries, rather than what is driving our corporate behavior and our competitive behavior.
Yeah, really good point. Daniel, anything to add there?
Well, perhaps a few quick thoughts. In the specific case of the, I agree with everything Ken said. In the specific case of the mining sector, of course, this is a fundamental business model challenge because the miners are in the business of digging new stuff out of the ground. And it's interesting how some are, some more advanced than others are investing more in recycling businesses. So it's arguably a parallel shift in a shift in business model, albeit step by step, to what some of the big oil and gas companies have done, as some, at least some of them, have invested more in renewable energy. So anyway, circularity applied to the extractive sector is very interesting. Secondly, quick thought is that the circularity is, I believe, hugely important, will become more so going forward. At the same time, we also need to pay a lot of attention, again, thinking of extraction of natural resources, to the fairness impacts of circularity on resource extracting economies, particularly poorer ones, where are we basically saying to them that, say, the richer countries are going to go circular and we're not going to buy their commodities as much as before? So this is not an argument against circularity, but it's a bit like, there needs to be a just transition in that respect. And then finally, metrics. I mean, the whole issue, Chad, you'll know better than anyone on this, the whole issue of, sustainability metrics for companies is hugely complicated. And arguably what's happened, over the last 10 years is there become too many metrics that companies need to report on, to the extent that there's so many that they no longer, to Ken's point, they're no longer really a driver of business performance. They're a driver of producing a sustainability report. And so it may be that circularity metrics should be focused on those, should be driven hardest for those industries and companies where it is core, it can be core to the business.
That's really key. If I could just add one quick thing, so we go to the questions. When I was working with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is a large global company, about 150 companies, we ranked their sustainability report from number 1 to number 150. And we had a third party do this, evaluate it. Was it clear? Was it representative? They talked to everything they should talk about. And at first, they really didn't want to do that. They didn't want to have the report. Obviously, we kept it confidential. Only they saw their report. But the impact it had when you found out you were number 140 out of 150 really made you think differently about your report. It made you think about, you can't just put all this fluff stuff in that really sounds good. It's all true, but it doesn't represent the total message. Something about that transparency and focusing on that report being meaningful really helped. So I think more and more we could do that without trying to make somebody look bad, just give them an opportunity to make their report more robust. Roberto, back to you.
We have questions here from our distinguished fellow Hippolyte Fofang. Hippolyte, until recently, was the chief economist of the African Import and Export Bank. And he's a fellow with the GFCC, Harper University, the University of Columbia, etc. Right? So his question is about how to change the practices. How do we ensure that minerals extraction is the climate change is different from past practices, where natural resources extraction was really led to the development of countries in the north, but also with externalities and negative externalities in the global south, especially in Africa, right? So how can we do that, really create value in Africa, not just valuing the global north, is Hippolyte's question.
Darren, you go first, then I'll come in after you.
Sure, and indeed, well, both Ken and Chad, you'll both have very good insights on this. So, look, in terms of creating, it's obviously a hugely important issue and question, and one which many countries have long, sought to create more value add from, beyond primary extraction of minerals or oil and gas or whatever the commodity is. And only, not that many countries have made that transition. If you look at mineral extraction, you have the examples of Botswana and Chile, which are both countries that have, created broad-based economic growth from minerals, but many others haven't. And it's hugely, to my mind, it's a very, very delicate balance for the governments of, resource-rich but developing countries, where layering the right demands on the foreign investors in terms of building refineries or smelters or other forms of beneficiation without deterring the investment in the first place. And that's the balance that is very difficult to strike. The positive news, I think, is that the world, being the state of the world as it is, where you no longer just have the West, but you have the West and China and many Middle Eastern powers and other powers all now competing, certainly in the mineral space, means that there's greater, freedom of maneuver on the part of the governments of resource-rich countries. So they should be able to, in a position to strike better deals. But there's also a risk with that new picture, which is that the deals are not struck on the basis of who is creating the most in-country value added, but it's rather who's creating the most corrupt upside for the elites of the relevant countries. And so it could go either way, right? I don't have a simple answer.
No, I think you're right, Daniel. There isn't a simple answer. I think the thing that's very different, though, from maybe a century or more ago, is the fact that the corporate organizations and the governments, to some extent, are operating in plain sight of not only their citizens, but also citizens in other countries. So the prevalence of social media and the way in which media works now is that the consequences of investment, positively and negatively, are just known and understood much more in real time than they were. And the result of that is that could have an immediate corporate effect in terms of how that company is seen or how that valuation of that company is in that particular way. I think that, and on the one hand, I think it's absolutely right that if there is a consequence to extraction, then that consequence should be mitigated on the part of the beneficiaries of that extraction. So, and that should be tied together in a much more robust way. And if we go back to the reporting element we talked about before, the ability of the corporate organization to be able to tell some of those stories, that not only did they get access to these resources, but also they did something with the community, for the community, and the community ultimately benefiting. But as you said before, that's all predicated on good governance in the country where the deal is happening, because it's all well and good having the intention of giving the resources for a good effect on the community, but we've got plenty of examples where that money goes there with the intention, but it never gets there. It gets siphoned off into different places. So as you say, it's complicated, but I do think the prevalence of the imagery, the knowledge, the speed at which these consequences can be reported, the way in which, the lack of quality of life on the part of certain people can be reported in real time, and therefore have a much more immediate effect on a corporate organization than maybe it would have done a century ago.
Roberto?
Yeah, we have another question for Hippolyte that I believe is very much connected to what you guys have commented, including what you just said, Ken, and it's about technology, right? How can science and technology be used, not, he writes, not a rent-seeking tool and geopolitical leverage alone, but as a tool that could lift countries that are coming from behind in this context? Would you have any examples, any ideas on how to do that in the context of natural resources development projects?
I can't give an example from a developing country, but I can give an obvious example from a developed country is Australia. And obviously I was in Australia for a long period of time. It is both an extracting country, but it's also managed to develop a significant economic benefit to the country as a whole as a result of being an extracting country. So you've seen how, as a country, it has developed at a great pace. And the fact that if you have a look at Australian universities, they are for the scale per capita, they are well overrepresented in the top 100 universities in the world because they have managed to get the benefit of the natural resources that they've got. But it also goes back to the same, there's another example of the issues that Daniel was talking about before, because obviously that has come at the cost of, in many cases, the relationship with Indigenous people within Australia. So, who has benefited? Well, the people who have benefited are disproportionately not the Indigenous nations within Australia, it's the other. But there is an example of a country that knew it had the resources, has managed to both internally how it's used them, but also externally how it's sold them, managed to significantly accelerate its economic development and its social development, but it still has got the issues that Daniel referred to before about community impact, and particularly on Indigenous nations in different parts of the country.
I don't have anything huge to add. I mean, but just perhaps to observe on the technology front, obviously China's extraordinary leaps ahead in creating clean energy supply chains, from solar panels to batteries, which are partly based on its domestic natural resources, partly based on imports. But that sort of application of technology and manufacturing and is just and a degree of forward thinking that has now, in a sense, imperiled the West and its attempts to sort of free itself of sort of natural resource dependencies.
Nothing to add, Roberto.
We have a question here from Claudia that I think is, this is for you, Daniel, but is how can we do in practice or manage, implement the complex dialogues and fact-finding missions that you mentioned to deal with this complex social realities, right? Which, by the way, we find there's not just in the natural resources domain, but if we think, for instance, health systems, right? Other things. But so her question is, how do you do that in practice? You mentioned this fact-finding, having different stakeholders together. What's the secret sauce of that?
It may be that there's different secret sauce for each situation, but I guess to my mind, common characteristics are, first of all, having mediators and facilitators who are deeply locally trusted by the relevant sides, and finding the right people to do that, because quite often in my experience, there's been an attempt to mediate, but the mediator is perceived to be biased or out of touch. Secondly, I think it's having a sufficiently long time frame, and I'll perhaps give an example of this in a second. Or perhaps let me sort of jump to an example. The one I have in mind is of a big mining project in Peru called the Quellaveco copper project, which was facing very severe opposition from local farmers and other community groups, to the extent that the developer of the project, Anglo American, the big mining company, originally was unable to move ahead. And rather, I guess, to caricature this, a traditional tactic of a mining company would be to hire a PR firm to spread the message and hammer it home, and to take out adverts and just to lobby the government and try and push this ahead against the instincts of some of the local groups. What Anglo American did wisely was to create a process of dialogue where it brought in respected Peruvian mediators, one in particular. It put the project on pause. It recognized that that pause would have to last potentially for many, many months, if not years. And it entered into a dialogue which was not around, you know, how do we just get this ahead? It's more like as I mentioned earlier, it's more about what does the region look like in the future? As a result of a dialogue and also a willingness, and this is another common characteristic, a willingness on particularly on the side of the developer to adapt the original business model and business plan. And that's what Anglo-American did. It wasn't just the process of dialogue, and this resulted in success in the sense that while there are now some problems, I mean, no major project is without some opposition. The dialogue process allowed the project to get sufficient sanction. And one key element of it was not just the involvement of all parties, the communities, civil society, regional government, national government. It was also Anglo-American redesigned its investment, and in particular invested in fresh water supplies for the local farmers. A fairly significant investment, but not significant compared with the billions of capital expenditure that the company had to take. So a long answer to the question is the right intermediators who are trusted, the right design of the process, bringing in all parties rather than just a few, not trying to hammer home messages, but being open to change. And I think that is, if that may be said to be magic sauce, I would say that's it.
Roberto, if I could add, just the one example of that I experienced that's the best of my life, if you will. So this may gauge my life, but it's the best of my life. And this was with Shell. We were going to Western Canada, and we were thinking about putting a liquefied natural gas facility in to export LNG. And we're going to a very, very small town where this would be located, the facility, because of access to the water. It didn't even have a hotel. And so we're going to have to stay 80 kilometers away in a hotel and just go in to meet. We said, no, we got to stay in the town. And so we finally found the local medical doctor had 3 extra rooms in his house that he could be tempted into renting out. So we stayed in the doctor's house. We wanted to have a dinner with the local officials and the different parties that had a point of view. And there's no place to go. So the doctor said, well, you can have dinner in my house and I'll cook the food for you. So he was there cooking the food, serving us, and he knew the community well because he was their doctor for everybody. And he heard the stories we heard from each one of the different people, the ones that really wanted to say or the ones that had discussion about it. He heard the whole story. And then we got through. He sat down with us with a glass of wine, and we stayed up till 1 a.m. when he made sense for it. He was saying, here's the perspective. Here's what I hear from my patients every day. Here's what they care about. We learned more in that interchange than I've ever had in a trip, because you were able to get to the crust of what's going on. I think what Daniel is saying is find the way in that situation to get to the real facts and the real feelings of people, and don't stop till you do it. Roberto?
I think we are about to close the session, Chad. I'll just read questions. We have like 3 minutes to close. So just quickly read 2 questions for people who have in mind, and then turn back to you. One is from Emmanuel, and he asks about communications. What is the biggest communications gap that we find in this type of context? And the other one is from Mark, and Mark asks about losers and winners, particularly in the case of circularity. So if you change an economic system, there are some types of industries, businesses that maybe we will lose revenue, and others that are innovating and coming up with new solutions will win. And Mark is saying, hey, those who will be opposing change are the losers, not the winners and innovators, right? How do you deal with that? Those are the 2 remaining questions we had here, but I think it's time to close, Chad. So back to you.
We'll go just quickly, Daniel. Could you talk about the communications thing? And quickly, Ken, could you talk about the circularity issue?
Yeah.
So my very brief thoughts on communications gap. Yes, the common communications gap from a company or developer perspective is just being culturally, I guess, either insensitive or ignorant, and so therefore communicating in language that unintentionally riles and annoys the local communities. By the same token, local communities, you know, they often don't, they're so understandably ill-equipped to assess the data and the engineering plans and so forth to understand what they mean for them. And there's that, so there's a need to, there's a communication gap on both sides, to my mind.
Excellent. Ken?
Yeah, just quickly, I think we're just going to have to help people to have a better understanding of losing and winning. So if going to Daniel's example before, if I have made a huge amount of money from mineral extraction and I've left a devastating consequence behind, and circularity means I'm not going to do as much of that in the past, then maybe I'll have a country which survives a bit longer into the future, because if we just carry on the way we are on a path which is actually going to destroy quality of life for all of us, not just for some of us. So I think there's some realignment for us to do over what winning and losing is. And I'm not sure in the current political climate it's easy to have that said, but I think it's going to be necessary. And it's the job of universities like this one and where Daniel is and others to make sure that the next generation come out with a very, very different view on what winning and losing actually means. And it's not just individual, it's collective.
Ken, wonderful. I think that's a great way to close the conference today. You should be receiving the link now about the report we referred to multiple times. If you're still here on this call, you should read that report. It will be worthwhile to you, I assure you. Roberto, thank you for your GFCC team and everybody working on this. It's been a great call. So long, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Chad, Daniel, Ken, thank you so much. And everybody, thanks for being here.
Thank you.